morning, everyone. It's so great to see all of you there this morning. We feel as if we were in the room, but it is also horrible and shocking to think that we spoke to you back in October, not expecting that this war would go on for so long. And here we are again. We also, I think, need to remember that the majority of the population in Gaza has been in a state of flux and in a state of being expelled from their homes for over 75 years. When Jim and I first visited Gaza in 1975, people had already been living as refugees, the majority of the population of the Gaza Strip, for nearly 30 years. And now it's 75 years since the majority were first expelled from villages in southern Israel. And so this trauma that has recently erupted is an ongoing part of an ongoing situation that has lasted for over 75 years. Let us just take you through the points that we're going to cover this morning. We'll quickly review some background that we shared with you before. Then we will go on and talk about the toll that the conflict has had on Gaza to date and Israel, and the global response to this crisis. Following that, we'll talk a bit about Biden administration policy and reaction to it. And then we will continue by reviewing this amazing worldwide Quakers statement that has recently come out that we'd like to share with you today.
Okay, by way of background, we're going to revisit some of the slides that we used in October for those of you who weren't there, and as a refresher for those of you who were. This is a map of Israel and Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza in green, and it shows you the population balance. The main point is there are about an equal number of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs living between the river and the sea. About 6.8 million now, probably nearly 7 million people in an area roughly the size of the state of Vermont, which pretty much fits the profile of Vermont if you stand Vermont on its head. And the West Bank, even smaller, that's the upside down state of Delaware that's superimposed over the West Bank. But the main point of this is to realize how tiny the Gaza Strip is. Here's Gaza superimposed over Bucks County, and as you can see, it's about the size of the Central Bucks and New Hope Salisbury school districts. That is where all of the conflict is now taking place, and where those in Gaza about are crowded together. North of Gaza, Gadi, Deir al-Balah, Khan Yunis, and Rafah are the divisions, sort of the townships of the Strip. This is where the population was concentrated before October 7th. The largest majority living up around Gaza City in the north. Today, a population map of Gaza would be reversed as about 1.4, 1.7 million have fled to the south, to the Rafah area, all the way at the south. As we've reviewed in the past, Gaza has been under assault by Israel several times in the past, 2008, 2012, 2014. But you can see the death tolls there are nothing compared to what they have been this time, nor has the duration of this war have any precedent in the past. As you can see, 2008, 23 days, less than a month, 8 days, less than 2 months in 2014, and only 11 days in which only 260 people were killed in 2021. But today, we're facing a very different situation. And we thought we'd revisit this slide from our October 10th presentation. It's from an op-ed that appeared in the New York Times on the 14th of October by Peter Boehnert, who is a very prominent progressive Jewish journalist in New York and writes frequently for the Times. Peter's prediction has sadly proven all too prescient. The days to come are likely to bring dislocation and death on a scale that should haunt the conscience of the world. And that indeed is what has happened in the wake of the day that, as Peter wrote, witnessed the greatest one-day loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust. Here is the United Nations agency's very sterile and anodyne presentation of the cost to date. As of last week, the death count was 34,262 people facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity, over 1 million, 1.7 million internally displaced, 75% of the population of Gaza. And here again is a graph of the mounting death toll as the conflict has continued. Other sectors of Gaza and the destruction that they've suffered are portrayed here. The most important part of this chart is the record of trucks that have been able to enter Gaza to bring civilian supplies since the war began. And as you'll see in the last week or so, there's been a bit of a surge. I think the maximum, it's covered on my screen by Zoom, but about 250 or 300 trucks in the best day since the war began. And that follows what all reports indicate were a fairly stern conversation between President Biden and Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu. But the most important thing to note here is that before the war began, before October 7th, the average number of trucks entering Gaza every day to meet the basic needs of the population, that number was 500. And instead of the pre-war levels ever being reached, we're running at best, 50, 60% in a situation where the need is much, much greater than it was before the war began. So just the number of trucks entering the country is a very stark index of the humanitarian need in the country. Here's another depiction of the story of Gaza's destruction that appeared in The Guardian. Imagine that Gaza is a community of 100 people, refugees, native residents, 2.2 million people into this tiny area the size of 2 school districts in Bucks County. And although it has been closed off under siege by Israel for 17 years, still there was some semblance of normal life that took place there. As the graphic says, farmers could be seen relaxing at the seashore, or families could be seen relaxing at the seashore. There was agriculture going on, there was industry. But now 25% of the population are starving. 85% of the population has been dislocated. 1% of the population has been killed. And in real terms, that means about 550,000 people starving, 1.9 million people displaced, and over 30,000 dead now. As unprecedented as this level of destruction in Gaza has been, we have to be grateful for the unprecedented mobilization that has come in the wake of the assault and the destruction. It has literally been everywhere in the world, including in our backyards. This is a picture of demonstrators blocking I-76 in Philadelphia early on in the war. This is out here in Seattle with protesters blocking I-5, the equivalent of I-95 that runs through Seattle. This was a magnificent demonstration at rush hour in Grand Central Station in New York, again, early on in the conflict. And if you
And I think it's important to point out that that banner, "Never again for anyone," has become the slogan for the leading Jewish organization that have been acting in response to this conflict, the Jewish Voice for Peace. So I think this is something that's very important to point out. Jews around the world, but especially American Jews, are leading the effort to stop this conflict.
And also back home in 30th Street Station, a similar demonstration. Again, Jewish Voice for Peace was in the forefront of organizing calls for a ceasefire, opposition to the war. This was a very creative demonstration put on by an organization that we are close to called Nonviolence International. Pictured there is Jonathan Kutab, who will be a keynote speaker at Friends General Conference at Haverford this June, I think it is, June or July.
Sure.
And Nonviolence International projected this image, "Never Again for Anyone," on the wall of the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Mennonites, typically less involved in the public arena than Friends often are, have witnessed an unprecedented mobilization in response to this conflict. This is a picture of several hundred Mennonites just before they were arrested in the rotunda of the Cannon House office building in Washington, demonstrating for a ceasefire and presenting one of the other slogans that's become very common in the campaign against the war, to just let Gaza live. And I must say, if I could have taken part in any of the demonstrations that have been held so far, my favorite would have been this one, because if you hear audio from this, the Mennonites are there singing these wonderful traditional hymns in 4-part harmony as the police put on the plastic handcuffs and carry them away. Really, really, truly inspirational. And the conflict has also been an occasion for Christians, Muslims, and Jews to come together and demonstrate together, calling for peace in Gaza. This took place just outside Philadelphia at a prominent evangelical church when Muslim, Jewish, and other Christians called attention to the congregation and the pastor of what was going on in Gaza, because typically this congregation had been in what's often called the Christian Zionist camp, whose interpretation of the Bible leads them to pay very little attention to what's happening on the ground to people in Israel and Palestine now. This demonstration had a very positive result. The demonstrators were invited in, they prayed with the congregation, and began a dialogue with the pastor and the congregation. And this is a demonstration that Deb and I were able to attend ourselves on the second day of Passover here in Seattle. Again, led by Jewish Voice for Peace, people gathered to have what they called a Seder in the streets. The Seder, of course, is the traditional Passover meal. And JVP had adapted the Haggadah, the traditional service for the Seder, to the situation in Gaza. And they even had a klezmer brass band to keep the crowd going before the service began. And part of the witness was to paint this huge mural in the street in front of the federal office building, particularly, they said, to show Patty Murray, one of our two senators, the demand to let Gaza live and to have no funds for genocide. But perhaps most dramatically, demonstrations have erupted on campuses all over the United States. This picture reminded me of the Vietnam era with demonstrations on campus. This is at the University of Texas in Austin. This is in Harvard Square just about a week ago. And this is right back home in the Philadelphia area at Swarthmore College. Israel bombs, SWAT pays. That's one of the leaders of the demonstration. And again, Jewish students in the forefront of the campaign to stop the slaughter. And as in other campuses, the common protest has been to set up encampments, an indication of the tents that Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are living in now on the college greens. And Swarthmore, like so many colleges, has so far come up with an ambiguous response. Swarthmore hasn't called in the police yet, but as you can see, they're taking a very cautious and critical approach to the demonstrations. The encampment on Parish is deeply concerning and will be included in our ongoing investigation of possible policy violations. At least hinting at a punitive approach. All of these campus demonstrations have occasioned comments from Benjamin Netanyahu. I need to move this over. And we're just going to play a short clip of Prime Minister Netanyahu's take on these demonstrations.
What's happening on America's college campuses is horrific. Anti-Semitic mobs have taken over leading universities. They call for the annihilation of Israel. They attack Jewish students. They attack Jewish faculty. This is reminiscent of what happened in German universities in the 1930s. It's unconscionable. It has to be stopped. It has to be condemned and condemned unequivocally. But that's not what happened. The response of several university presidents was shameful. Now, fortunately, state, local, federal officials, many of them have responded differently, but there has to be more.
And now a response to Mr. Netanyahu from Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders.
No, Mr. Netanyahu, it is not anti-Semitic or pro-Hamas to point out that in a little over 6 months, your extremist government has killed 34,000 Palestinians and wounded more than 78,000, 70% of whom are women and children. It is not anti-Semitic to point out that your bombing has completely destroyed more than 221,000 housing units in Gaza, leaving more than 1 million people homeless, almost half the population. It is not anti-Semitic to note that your government has obliterated Gaza's civilian infrastructure, electricity, water, and sewage. It is not anti-Semitic to realize that your government has annihilated Gaza's healthcare system, knocking 26 hospitals out of service and killing more than 400 healthcare workers. It is not anti-Semitic to condemn your government's destruction of all of Gaza's 12 universities and 56 of its schools, with hundreds more damaged, leaving 625,000 students with no educational opportunities. It is not anti-Semitic to agree with virtually every humanitarian organization in saying that your government, in violation of American law, has unreasonably blocked humanitarian aid coming into Gaza, creating the conditions in which so many thousands of children face malnutrition and famine. Mr. Netanyahu, anti-Semitism is a vile and disgusting form of bigotry that has done unspeakable harm to many millions of people. But please, do not insult the intelligence of the American people by attempting to distract us from the immoral and illegal war policies of your extremist and racist government. Do not use anti-Semitism to deflect attention from the criminal indictment you are facing in the Israeli courts. It is not anti-Semitic to hold you accountable for your actions.
And with that rejoinder to Prime Minister Netanyahu, let's review what the Biden administration has been doing in response to the conflict. Here again, we'll revisit one of the slides we used on October 10th. That day, President Biden affirmed his support for Israel's right to respond to the Hamas attacks of October 7th. But he also mentioned the need for Israel to conduct its response in accord with the laws of war. At the time, we were grateful for that reference to international humanitarian law and the limits that it imposes on military action. But we were very worried that those words would be nothing more than words, and that the main effective message would be that Israel could respond with full force as it saw fit. And that is pretty much what has happened. We thought a good analysis and summary of what the Biden administration policy has been was represented last Sunday in an op-ed in the New York Times by this gentleman, Trita Parsi. Trita was someone very close to the Friends Committee on National Legislation. I worked with him in 2010 to 2014, mostly on Iran issues. He is now at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Quincy Institute is very interesting. Its principal funding comes both from Robert Koch on the extreme right and George Soros on the extreme left. And Soros and Koch, concerned over the polarization and the militarization of American foreign policy, together funded the Quincy Institute in Washington, where Trita is now working. And he begins by giving President Biden credit for averting what could have been the beginning of a full-scale regional war involving Iran and Israel, and possibly dragging the United States in, by exerting strong pressure on Netanyahu after the attack by Iran, when Iran sent about 200-300 missiles against Israel, and in response to Israel's unprecedented bombing of the Iranian consulate in Damascus, killing 3 leading Iranian generals, and did not allow Israel to carry out any more than a symbolic action that was limited enough, Trita writes, that Iran could pretend it hadn't been attacked at all. But while the president's maneuvering helped avoid an immediate disaster, and he deserves credit for that, his own policies are the things that have set the Middle East on its current dangerous trajectory. And basically, despite those words at the beginning of the conflict that Israel should abide by international law, the administration has done very little to exercise its influence over the Netanyahu government to moderate its behavior. We've continued to send arms to Israel, despite the International Court of Justice saying there's a plausible case that this is an instance of genocide. The Biden administration has twice sent arms without congressional consent. And most importantly, the U.S. has vetoed UN Security Council resolutions demanding a ceasefire. And when the U.S. abstained on one resolution so that it passed, the U.S. ambassador to the UN immediately said that although it was a Security Council resolution, in the U.S. view, it was non-binding. And while President Biden has often said he supports a two-state solution, his policies at best have ignored Palestinians' right to statehood, and at worst, they've directly blocked them. The administration was doing very little with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict before the October 8th attacks, and had not reversed any of the adverse actions taken by the Trump administration, cutting off contact between the Palestinian Authority and the United States government. So in response to all of this, we were extremely gratified last week when Quaker organizations around the world issued this statement: "A different future is possible. Quaker organizations share a vision for peace in Palestine and Israel." The American Friends Service Committee, the Canadian Friends Service Committee, FCNL, the Friends World Committee for Consultation, Quakers in Britain, Quaker Council on European Affairs, Quaker Peace and Social Witness, which is the British equivalent of AFSC, and the Quaker United Nations Office came together to issue this incredibly prescient statement, I think. And you all have links to it that Melanie sent out yesterday. I encourage you to read the description of the conflict, because I think it portrays better than any other document in the present all that has happened and what the realities are between Israelis and Palestinians, building on decades of Quaker experience in the region. This is the preamble to the statement, and the emphasis is on action. As Quakers and as peacemakers, we're called to actively live into our testimonies of equality and peace. To this end, we urgently put forward these calls to action. Now, first, to others.
To the Israeli government: end attacks on Gaza. Cease settler and military violence in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Guarantee uninterrupted, unconditional humanitarian access in Gaza and open land crossings. Hold accountable those who have violated the law or committed human rights abuses. Release Palestinian political prisoners and hostages and provide fair trials following international standards, and guarantee the self-determination of Palestinians by ending the occupation.
And to Hamas and other armed Palestinian groups, release the hostages. Commit to a permanent ceasefire as a long-term just and sustainable peace is sought, and hold accountable those who have violated the law, and that includes international humanitarian law, or committed human rights abuses.
To Western leaders, US and UK governments in particular, press for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, end complicity in Israeli human rights violations, actively work to ensure uninterrupted humanitarian access in Gaza, hold accountable those who have violated the law or committed human rights abuses, uphold international law, demand equal accountability for state and non-state actors, support an end to Israel's occupation and equal protection and rights for all, and finally, ensure an inclusive political process for peace that incorporates all voices.
But most importantly, perhaps, the Quaker statement addresses Quakers ourselves and urges everyone in the global Quaker community to urgently call and work for a permanent ceasefire and find ways to amplify our voices in our communities at the local, state, and national level. encourage decision makers calling for a ceasefire and working for peace, organize and participate in teach-ins, actions, and protests until a ceasefire and a just and lasting peace are realized, actively support an end to Israel's occupation and equal protection and rights for all people living under Israeli control, divest from corporations profiting from militarism, including the occupation of Palestine, support those in Israel and Palestine, and there are many of them who are working for peace. Friends, I think this is the most important part of the statement. It's a call to action from all of our Quaker organizations, which are encouraging Friends meetings, Friends schools, other Quaker organizations to sign on to this statement. Here's the list of Friends meetings, including and schools. I see Germantown Friends schools there who have signed the Quaker statement. And we would very much encourage Falls to look at the statement and to consider whether or not the Fallsington meeting can also lend its name to this list.
And you'll also see the monthly meeting of Friends in Philadelphia has signed on as well.
And we were debating last night whether that's 4th and Arch or 15th and Cherry, but it's one of the two main Philadelphia meetings. So that's the main point. Quaker organizations can sign on to the statement. There you have a link to the statement on the website. There you will find a sign-up sheet where a Quaker meeting or other Quaker organization can lend its name to this statement. So we just thought we'd finish with one statement that we found very, very compelling and moving. It was made on the first day of Passover in Israel, at a demonstration held by the parents and the relatives of Israelis who are still held hostage by Hamas. And this is a statement by the mother of one of the captured Israeli soldiers who was being held hostage by Hamas. And of course, Passover commemorates the Exodus, the flight of Jews from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land. And Mrs. Zangwacker says, invading Rafah, which the Netanyahu administration is threatening to do, invading Rafah is not Exodus. It is not a flight from slavery. It is enslavement to more war that will bring us nothing. So thank you very much for listening, friends. And we would be happy to have your comments or any questions.
Yes, thanks for giving us this opportunity.
So I was wondering if there's a way to find out about local protests, if there's a website. And my second question was, is there a way to find out which corporations invest in Israeli arms?
Yeah, I can help you with the second one. I think if you contact the American Friends Service Committee and ask them for a list, they can provide that, I believe, Jim.
I think
Or BDS is the other.
we will send everyone a link, but before you get that, if you'd like to check yourselves, if you simply Google boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or just BDS list of companies, there is a website maintained by AFSC and other organizations in coalition with it that do list current campaigns and also all of the companies that are invested with military relations with Israel. We will send you that link, but there is a national website that's out there. As for local events, that's the question we ourselves had in Seattle, and we found that there is a website where they're all listed. There must be something in the Philadelphia area. One good way to find out would be to Google the local chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace, a JVP. Philadelphia. I think if you Google Jewish Voice for Peace Philadelphia, you'd probably find a list of things that are taking place. I'm not aware of any ongoing demonstrations that Quakers have organized in Philadelphia, but then again,
They
we're
participate.
3,000 miles. No, I'm sure they participated. We're 3,000 miles away, but I'm sure that information will be readily available. And if we find anything, we'll also send you that link to the Falls meeting list. Thanks, Sue.
Jim and Debbie, thanks again for your expertise and for such a comprehensive lecture. Really
Good
appreciate
speech.
it. Would you spell the name of the author from the Quincy Institute that you mentioned before?
Yes, Trita, Trita, last name Parsi, Parsi, and
Peter?
P is in Peter, Arsi, Parsi. And if you just Google his name, the results will be legion. And I'm sure you'll find some very interesting things to read, both about Israel-Palestine and about Iranian-American relations. Trita was one of the co-founders of an organization called the National Iranian American Council, NIAC, which is the progressive American Iranian organization. They're not pro-Shah, but they're not pro-Ayatollahs either. They support human rights in Iran, but they also recognize that Iran and the United States have issues to resolve, and that any war with Iran would be counterproductive both for the Iranian people and for U.S. relations with Iran in the Middle East. They were and are in coalition with FCNL on both Iran and Israel-Palestine issues, meeting weekly with FCNL staff to design strategies to try to improve American policy. And he's an extraordinarily articulate and incisive mind. So I encourage you to read anything that he's done.
I have a little contextual question about the relationship between the US and Israel for so many decades, exporting arms or selling arms to Israel. But I guess the bigger point is that selling arms around the world is one of the economic engines of our country, shamefully. And it's just such an old problem, this terrible situation in this region. It was long before Biden. I think it's a part of a machine that he has inherited, because obviously the humanitarian crisis, anyone looking at it would really understand the wrongness of the approach, the Netanyahu approach. And so, I don't know, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, if you talk about American arms sales, the first thing that comes to my mind is, showing my age, is President Eisenhower's warning in his valedictory speech when he left the presidency of the dangers of the military-industrial complex that was pushing for unnecessary arms production. And every dollar for guns, Eisenhower said something to the effect, was taking food out of the mouths of children. This coming from the preeminent general of World War II. And that certainly has characterized American policy ever since the 1950s. And it's an issue that FCNL and other organizations keep banging away on year after year. In fact, the current ask for the FCNL advocacy groups, advocacy teams around the country, including the one in Bucks County, is to make a tiny, tiny bit of improvement in the military procurement system or the military budgeting system to no longer make compulsory the service organizations from providing Congress with additional arms and additional components that they want, but which are not budgeted by the administration. Every year, the administration prepares a Defense Department budget. But in addition to the budget that comes down from the White House to Congress, the heads of the different service organizations, the heads of the intelligence organizations are required by law to provide Congress with lists of things that were not included in the budget. And Congress traditionally adds many of those things over and above the administration's request into the defense budget. And last year, though, that wish list had grown to the scale of $25 billion. Now, not all $25 billion of those wish list items were approved, but many of them were. So as modest as it seems, it would be an improvement if the service organizations, the heads of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Space Force, etc., were no longer required by law to provide those lists to Congress. They could still do it if they wanted to, but they would not be required by law to do it. And that very modest little bit is what FCNL advocacy teams are working on this year. And we have some chance of success. So it is, a problem that distorts the entire world economy and sends resources in the preparation for war and the act of war instead of meeting human needs. And certainly the U.S. is an exceptional nation in this regard. We spend far more money for weapons and on war than other countries do.
I did want to bring one concern that had been emailed to me, that there really can't be peace in Gaza if Hamas is in control as the government. And so, in so many of these protests, just having a balance of concern for human rights across the board is so crucial to building trust. We were speaking with a friend yesterday, a Jewish friend, who said in the first time in her life, she and her children are afraid they will end up in death camps. So for some Jews, even though there are Jews that are at the forefront of these protests, in many cases, there are others that are just feeling absolutely terrified. And so this is where we are.
There's no doubt that anxiety levels in the Jewish community are higher than they've been in decades. And there's no doubt that two versions of anti-Semitism are growing. One not at all related to Israel-Palestine, but typified by the slogan, Jews will not replace us. The crazy right-wing American belief that Jews are encouraging immigration by people of color in order to displace white Christians in America. That kind of crazy conspiratorial anti-Semitism is growing. And I mean, it is certainly true that the actions of the Netanyahu government are promoting, pushing people into an anti-Semitism that is related to Israel-Palestine. And of course, the way to reverse that is to reverse the terrible slaughter that's going on in Gaza. As for Hamas, I don't think any Palestinian believes that Hamas can bring about a peaceful and just solution of the Israel-Palestine conflict. The problem has been that the popular expression of the Palestinian will has been thwarted by the policies of, first and foremost, the Netanyahu government, in cahoots with the Palestinian Authority, whose electoral mandate is 15 years out of date, and also supported by the United States. Netanyahu has come under a lot of criticism in Israel for his policy of permitting large-scale funding, millions and millions of dollars coming from the Arab Gulf into Gaza to support Hamas, because Hamas in Gaza was a terrible rupture in the Palestinian society. Hamas in Gaza, the Palestinian Authority, basically at war with it in Ramallah. As long as the Palestinians were divided like that, the Netanyahu government's thinking was there can be no partner for peace. There can be no pressure on Israel to make concessions for a Palestinian state or any kind of end to the occupation. So once the war is over, I think the Israeli public will very likely take action against Netanyahu for that policy of encouraging Hamas and encouraging the division in Palestinian society. When we were there a year ago, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, had just recently canceled scheduled Palestinian elections that would have brought a fresh mandate and new leadership. Israel, the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, and the United States were all basically in cahoots to thwart any new expression of the Palestinian popular will. So part of solving the problem of Hamas is creating the conditions where Palestinians throughout the occupied territories can choose their own representatives.